This was the moment where Game 2, and maybe the whole series, started to slip away from Minnesota. They were down by just 3 points after having played a strong and focused 23 minutes. And then came a stretch that you simply cannot afford to mess up against Oklahoma City. The final minute of a quarter. That's when the Timberwolves let their guard down, and it cost them everything. The best teams, championship caliber teams, understand that to start and end quarters, that is where you have to be at your absolute best. And Oklahoma City, who have made a habit of seizing these windows all season long, did exactly that. First, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander calmly steps back and drills a big three, stretching the lead out to 6. Then, in a moment that summed up Minnesota's lapse in discipline, Donte DiVincenzo barreled in, committing a reckless offensive foul. And with only 8 seconds to go, it handed the final possession of the half to OKC, and they made it count. With only 8 seconds, SGA's able to go all the way down the floor and draw a foul on Jaden McDaniels, walking back to the free throw line where he calmly knocked them both down. What had been a 3-point game with under a minute to go, with the potential of maybe even taking the lead, suddenly ballooned out to an 8-point lead to the Thunder. And the Timberwolves didn't just lose the scoreboard in that moment, they handed Oklahoma City the momentum, confidence, and control, which ended up completely shifting the game. Out of halftime, Oklahoma City appeared as if they were on a mission, using that late burst to fuel one of their most dominant stretches of the season. They blitzed Minnesota in the third quarter, outscoring them 35-21, and the lead ballooned as large as 24 points with under a minute left to go in the next period, completely dismantling Minnesota. Now sure, there were other reasons why the game got away from the Timberwolves, just like it also did in Game 1, but it was this sequence that just felt like the breaking point, a stretch that sent Minnesota into a downward spiral that they simply could not pull out of. So with 2 games in the books, both convincingly being won by the Thunder on their home floor, this is where we're at. It might be tempting to look at these 2 games and just say, well, OKC's just the better team. And maybe that is true, but maybe not. There is still plenty to unpack, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Games 1 and 2 of this series between Minnesota and Oklahoma City have followed an eerily familiar script. In both contests, the Timberwolves managed to stay within striking distance in the first half, playing composed, competitive basketball, but as soon as that third quarter began, it all unraveled. The Thunder ramped things up, and Minnesota simply could not keep pace. The only real difference between games 1 and 2 was that in the second game, the Timberwolves did make an early push in the fourth quarter, but even that didn't feel legit. In my opinion, it was a fake comeback that never truly threatened OKC's grip of the game, and I'll dive more into that later. Game 2, the Wolves were outscored by 14 points in the third, and back in Game 1, it was a very similar story, losing that third quarter 32-18. That swing came off the back of OKC's suffocating defense, which turned Minnesota over and allowed them to get some easy transition buckets. And that, more than anything, has been the defining issue of the series: Minnesota's carelessness with the ball. This problem didn't just start here either. It's a continuation of a worrying trend that began back in the Golden State series. Despite winning that matchup, the Timberwolves were so reckless with the ball in hand. In their final 3 games against the Warriors, they turned the ball over 18 times in Game 3, 19 in Game 4, and 20 more times in the closeout Game 5. That's an absurd number of giveaways, especially against the Warriors team that was without Steph Curry and looked like a complete shadow of themselves. And yet, those games were still really competitive purely because Minnesota couldn't take care of the ball. Now fast forward into this series, facing an OKC team that statistically has been the best in the history of the NBA at converting turnovers into points, and that sloppiness is a giant red flag. Through the first 2 games, the Wolves racked up 17 giveaways in Game 1 and then another 14 in Game 2. But unlike the Warriors, OKC hasn't just capitalized. They've feasted 52 points off turnovers across 2 games. That is Minnesota's biggest problem by a mile. Coming in, I expected the Wolves to focus more on precision, to be deliberate deliberate and smart with every pass and possession. But instead, it's been the same story. And the frustrating part, so many of these turnovers haven't been forced. They are just plain, careless, lazy passes, all coming from terrible execution and a team that is nowhere near as locked in as they should be. Julius Randle in particular has been the glaring issue. Yes, he played really well in Game 1 offensively, putting up 28 points on 70% shooting, but he's also been the team's biggest turnover culprit, with 9 giveaways across the first 2 games. And then in Game 2, he shot just 2 of 11 for 6 points, as that kind of inefficiency combined with his poor decision making earned him a spot on the bench for the whole fourth quarter. And honestly, it was justified. Too many times he was just trying to back his man down with no real purpose, taking far too long to decide exactly what he was doing, along with turning his back to a Thunder defense who was swarming him every time and poking the ball free from behind. What makes all of this harder to swallow is that when Minnesota does play quick and decisive, they actually got great looks. OKC collapses hard anytime any Wolves player gets into the paint, leaving shooters wide open. But the problem is, those shooters aren't hitting. Before the series, I pinpointed Naz Reid, Dante DiVincenzo, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker as 3 guys who had to step up and knock down shots if the Wolves were going to stand a chance. So far, they've been completely unreliable. Game 2 was slightly better as they combined for 5 of 14 from 3, with Nickeil Alexander-Walker actually having a solid night himself, hitting 3 or 4 from deep. But Naz Reid once again could not buy a bucket from outside, missing all 5 of his threes. And in Game 1, that was a complete disaster. The 3 of them combined to shoot 5 of 28 from beyond the arc, and Naz Reid was again the biggest culprit, missing all 7 of his threes in that game, making him an abysmal 0 of 12 on the series. When that's happening, it is nearly impossible to create the kind of spacing needed to free up Randle and Edwards to attack the rim. And even they haven't been sharp either. Anthony Edwards shot just 1 of 9 from deep in Game 2 and appeared to be visibly hesitant on his jumpers, passing up even the open ones that he would usually take. That hesitation, combined with the turnovers, has Minnesota's offense in a full-blown crisis right now. So far, this series has been a harsh lesson in how fragile things can be in the postseason. And if the Timberwolves don't get a grip on their ball security and start making teams pay for overhelping on the drives, it's really hard to see how they turn this thing around. Right now, it is absolutely code red in Minnesota. But somehow, even with the turnovers, the missed shots, and the slow offensive decision making, the worst moment for the Timberwolves came in that third quarter of Game 2. And that's really saying something. There had been plenty of speculation heading into this series about whether or not Minnesota might try and borrow a page from Denver's playbook by throwing a zone defense at the Thunder. The Nuggets had used the zone coverage against the Thunder in the second round and had managed to disrupt OKC's offensive rhythm. But the difference was Denver had practiced that zone. Minnesota, not so much. They hadn't really ran the zone all season long, so if they were going to try it on the biggest stage of them all, the Western Conference Finals, they had to be absolutely certain that they were going to be able to execute at a high enough level. And personally, I didn't think we were going to see it at all. But how wrong, deeply wrong was I? What Minnesota attempted to roll out in that third quarter wasn't just ineffective, it was a catastrophe. It looked like the team had just drawn up a zone defense during halftime on a whiteboard and then tried to run it in the most important game of their season without any practice beforehand. Oklahoma City completely shredded it. The Thunder scored basically every time down, generating a staggering 1.13 points per possessions across 15 trips against the zone. For the Thunder to generate a quality shot against the zone, all they had to do was pass the ball twice around the perimeter and boom, there's a wide open jumper. Rinse and repeat. It was brutal to watch. What is even more baffling is how long the Timberwolves stuck with it. They had every opportunity to scrap the experiment early and go back to their man defense, something they're actually really good at, thanks to their strong individual defenders. But instead, they stayed in that zone, allowing OKC to go on a run that not only gave them control of that quarter, but effectively ended the game right then and there, embarking on a 30-10 run. It was like watching a team say, "Here, you take it. We're not interested in winning tonight." And when they finally did go back to that man defense in the fourth quarter, they instantly looked more comfortable, more competitive, and just better. But the damage had already been done. Now, to be fair, the old saying is that a series doesn't really start until a road team at least wins a game. And that sentiment still does hold weight. Minnesota certainly has the chance to go back home and defend home court, possibly trying to tie the series up and shift the narrative. But let's be honest, based on how thoroughly they were beaten in the first two games of the series, that's starting to feel more like wishful thinking than a realistic expectation. And to understand how we got to this point, you have to look at just how dominant the Thunder have been over these first two games of the series. Game 1 was the perfect storm. Everything going right for Oklahoma City and everything going wrong for the Wolves. Despite the fact Minnesota actually looked to be in control in that first half, with Randall being hot, SGA really cold, and the game being really close at halftime, everything flipped for the Thunder in the third term. Oklahoma City's defense came alive, and then their offense followed suit. The Thunder turned the Wolves over repeatedly and turned those miscues into points, generating 31 points off turnovers, and that alone was good enough to win the game. But what really stood out the most was how locked in this team was defensively. It wasn't just good, it was historically great. Oklahoma City became the first team since 1997 to score at least 30 points off turnovers while holding their opponent to 0 fast break points. That is the kind of metric that can completely define a playoff game and send a clear, strong message to an opponent. Then, in Game 2, a match that is traditionally very tough to win because the opposing team is just going to have more desperation, Oklahoma City managed to match Minnesota's energy and beat them again. It wasn't quite the same blowout on the scoreboard, but it did feel just as overwhelming. This time, it was the Thunder's stars taking the charge. SGA, now officially the league's MVP, played like it, exploding for 38 points, 8 assists, and 3 steals on 57% shooting. Jalen Williams was also sensational, turning into a mid-range assassin, connecting on 10 out of 14 from 2, finishing with 26 points, 10 rebounds, and 5 assists. What made Shai's Game 2 performance even more incredible, though, was how quietly dominant it was. He wasn't forcing anything. He wasn't taking over in loud bursts. He was calmly dismantling Minnesota, picking his spots like a true MVP. At halftime, he had already scored 19 points on 6 of 9 shooting, just quietly doing MVP things, while the Wolves were scrambling to keep up. And of course, that third quarter in Game 2 became another backbreaker. The Thunder's defense swarmed, their offense executed, and Minnesota's ill-fated zone experiment crumbled. Minnesota actually didn't hit a single three-pointer in the third term, and from that point on, the game fell out of reach. Even when the Timberwolves made that mini run in the fourth quarter, it just never felt real. It never felt like they were playing with the urgency or the juice needed to actually come all the way back. Contrast that with what Indiana just did to the Knicks a night before, with Tyrese Halliburton pushing the ball up the floor every single possession, playing with the aggression, the pace, and the urgency needed to actually win. Minnesota, on the other hand, looked completely gassed. They were just walking the ball up the floor, wasting 10 seconds of every possession before they even started to initiate any offense. It was slow, they looked tired, and it was never more evident than when Jaden McDaniels shoved SGA in the back. Just a clear act of frustration, maybe exhaustion, probably both. The Thunder never looked flustered. Even during Minnesota's little fourth quarter push, they were just cruising to the finish line. And that is where we are right now. OKC cruising and Minnesota searching for rhythm, for answers, and most importantly, a way to keep their season alive. So let's have a look. Is there anything the Timberwolves can actually take away from these first two games in order to turn the series around and get things back on their terms? difference? Personally, I actually think there is. Let's start with Anthony Edwards. Before Game 2, he promised that he was going to be more aggressive, and a big part of how he was going to do that was to move more off ball, similar to how he decided to attack the Lakers in round 1. And while there were flashes of that working, moments where he did find the space and force the Thunder to have to react, it wasn't quite enough to shift the tide. What feels even more important is that the Timberwolves as a team simply have to play faster. And I don't just mean push the ball in transition. I'm talking about the overall urgency to their entire offensive approach. All throughout Game 2, Minnesota was just walking the ball up the floor, wasting precious seconds before they even got into a set. That alone let OKC take so many possessions off on defense, as they were just allowing the Thunder to set up their half-court defense, as Minnesota played right into their hands. Even in the half-court, there were missed opportunities though, when the Wolves did try and attack, getting downhill, collapsing OKC's defense. They actually did create some great looks, especially on kickouts to the perimeter, but too often the shots either weren't being made or the pass was simply not being made, and that has to change. If Minnesota wants to loosen up the Thunder's defense, their outside shooters, guys like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Naz Reid, and Dante DiVincenzo have to be ready and willing to shoot in rhythm, and they have to do so at a much more effective rate than they showed over the first 2 games. They've got to be locked in off the catch, because when Oklahoma City overcommits or closes too hard, that is where the gaps in their defense begin to open up. The looks are there, and it's just a matter of taking advantage. And right now, the shooters simply aren't doing enough to punish the Thunder for their over-aggressive style of defense. Another adjustment that feels 100% necessary is scaling back the Rudy Gobert minutes. It's not that he's been terrible, it's just that this Thunder matchup is clearly not for him. They're too fast, too mobile, and with their 2 best scorers being mid-ranged assassins, Rudy Gobert really had no effect on this game. But if you are going to lean away from Rudy, then Naz Reid has to give you more, and he simply didn't. Same goes for Julius Randle. Even though he was benched in that fake comeback in the 4th quarter, the truth is, Minnesota is going to need him on the floor and playing better if they want a chance to win the series. The Wolves haven't had a single game in this series where both Edwards and Randle played well at the same time. Edwards was bad in Game 1, and then Randle faded to the background in Game 2. If they can both get going together, then that completely changes everything, like we've seen with this Timberwolves team over their playoff run so far. Still, beyond the rotation choices and the outside shooting, their biggest issue so far has to be their decision making. Minnesota just has to be smarter with the ball. So many of their turnovers were just completely unforced, just sloppy, really careless moments at the worst possible times, putting on full display, which in my opinion is their biggest weakness, their immaturity. And when you're handing the ball to a team like Oklahoma City, you're not just giving up a possession, you're often directly handing them points back the other way. It's not even like OKC was always creating the turnovers either, because half the time, Minnesota was just giving them away, and that cannot continue, because they were just shooting themselves in the foot. And speaking of teams shooting themselves in the foot, we only need to look back 24 hours to see what happened in Game 1 of the Knicks-Pacers series, as that was one of the most astonishing meltdowns in recent memory. And if you want to see how Indiana pulled off a 17-point comeback in 6 minutes, and whether or not I believe they are truly a threat to win the championship, you can check out this full breakdown right now, where I broke it down in full detail.